All right. Hello, fellow price theory classmates and Dr. Harker. My name is Sydney Thabet, and I'm going to be explaining to you guys about an Engle curve today. So before we can actually get started in explaining what an Engle curve is itself, we have to talk about how we go about finding what an Engle curve is. So the process that we go through by doing this is looking at our handy-dandy indifference curve and budget line graph that we've been using with x1 and x2 on either axis, finding the points at which our budget lines become tangent to our indifference curves, and then looking at that point specifically. What we do when we plot more than one of these lines and find those points of tangency is we do this thing called creating our income offer curve. And what this income offer curve illustrates is the bundles of goods that are demanded at different levels of income. So once we find this income offer curve, this kind of creates the basis for our Engle curve. So we'll go ahead and switch over here. This is what our Engle curve looks like. Looks very similar to our income offer curve that we had before, but the main distinction that we want to see here is that instead of x2 on this axis, we now have m equaling income. What the Engle curve describes is how our demand for two goods changes if we hold the prices of x1 and x2 constant, but then we change income. So this Engle curve is a graph for the demand for one of those goods in the function of income, with all other prices being held constant. So we're only looking at x1 in this situation when we create our Engle curve. So looking back to this first graph, we'll go ahead and see what the points are from our two earlier budget lines, find those points of tangency. Then we would create figurative numbers for these incomes and then graph them at the same points where we found our x on this graph, our x1 on this graph. So that's basically the breakdown of how a traditional Engle curve works. We can have Engle curves that will look a little bit different than this curved line. If we go ahead and draw another graph really quick, then we can see. All right. So we can go about making another Engle curve. For perfect substitutes, our line would be straight like this for our Engle curve, because in perfect substitutes, if the prices are exactly the same, then we'll choose to buy either or of those products. We have no preference between the two because they're perfect substitutes. So when our income changes, then our change in x1 demanded, which is down here, and there's that income up there. Our demand for x1 will stay consistent along the whole time that we're demanding this product. So that's why we have this straight line right here. Okay, so then, here, I'm just gonna erase this whole thing right here. We'll go about making a Engle curve for another kind of demand. So we'll just go ahead, oops, didn't make my line straight, there we go. So we'll go ahead and draw an Engle curve for what we would call perfect complements now. So if we remember from class, our perfect complements, I'm going to draw the perfect complements graph first. We make a set of right angles. This top one is not so straight, but that's all right. And then wherever, because we demand only as much of one of good x, 2, oh, that turned into a circle. We demand only as much of x2 as we do of x1, because we like to consume these together. Think about left and right shoes. So then we'll draw another nice straight line going through the middle of those. Since this line is straight as well, it means that our demand is consistent along these points. So if we go ahead and erase this, then we can find that when we draw our Engle curve, our demand will also stay consistent, because as income changes, then our quantity of X1 will stay consistent due to what we just saw on the graph before. Okay, so that basically explains what our Engle curve is in a couple situations in which we would see those Engle curves used. So now let's get to our test question from our test to see how we actually go about answering the question from the test. So I'm going to switch back to my original page. We can go ahead and erase this nice graph right here. So the question in the test reads, an Engle curve is a demand curve with a vertical and horizontal axis reversed. So let's just figure out what this question actually is saying. So an Engle curve is a demand curve with vertical and horizontal axes reversed. So what we need to do first is draw, I'm going to go ahead and make these lines straight. We're going to go ahead and draw a regular demand curve. My drawing skills are not on point. All right, so we'll go back here, draw one fancy line there, one right there. So as we know, our demand lines are positive sloping. So we're gonna, or negative sloping, my bad, our Engle curve is positive sloping. So for a demand curve that is downward sloping, we'll draw this like that. We know that this is our horizontal axis and that this is our vertical axis. So how the question reads, an Engle curve is a demand curve with the vertical and horizontal axes reversed. So what we have to do is we have to go about reversing both of these graphs, or sides of the graph. So if we redraw our graph, and this time we call this one our vertical, and we call this one our horizontal, we can see that our demand curve will still be downward sloping, because this point that was with our horizontal touching our axis before is now over here, and this point that was touching our vertical up here is now touching our vertical down here. So we can tell that this question is false, because it states that an Engle curve is a demand curve with the vertical and horizontal axes reversed. We know that this is false because if we draw our regular Engle curve,